The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of castle like ghostly fingers, and young Prince Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. At barely 10 years old, he possessed the curious nature that often led royal children into trouble, but today something felt different about the castle grounds. Lady, the king's new wife of only 6 months, had arrived with promises of bringing warmth to the cold halls that had known only sorrow since the queen's death 2 years prior. The prince's father, King Edmund, had been so grateful for her companionship that he seemed blind to the subtle changes that had begun to creep through the castle like shadows at twilight. The servants whispered in corridors when they thought no one was listening. Cook mentioned how Lady's eyes held secrets darker than the castle's oldest dungeons. The stable master spoke of how the horses grew restless whenever she passed by their stalls. Even the castle dogs, once friendly to all, now cowered when her silk slippers clicked across the marble floors. Prince Alexander had noticed these things too, though he could not quite understand what they meant. He only knew that since Lady's arrival, his father seemed more distant, more tired, and the laughter that once echoed through the great halls had been replaced by an eerie silence that made even the bravest knights speak in hushed tones. On this particular morning, the prince had been exploring the castle's eastern wing, a section that had been largely abandoned since his grandmother's time. The corridors here were narrow and dark, lit only by occasional windows that cast long rectangles of pale sunlight across dusty floors. Ancient portraits of long-dead relatives gazed down from their gilded frames with eyes that seemed to follow his movement. It was while examining a particularly intriguing tapestry depicting a great battle that Prince Alexander heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. He turned, expecting to see one of the cleaning staff or perhaps his tutor coming to fetch him for his morning lessons. Instead, Lady appeared around the corner, her emerald green dress rustling against the stone walls. Her smile was as beautiful as always, but something in her dark eyes made the prince's stomach tighten with an inexplicable unease. She moved with the grace of a cat stalking its prey, and her voice, when she spoke, carried a sweetness that felt somehow dangerous. "Alexander, my dear boy," she said, her voice echoing softly in the narrow corridor. "I've been looking everywhere for you. Your father has asked me to take you somewhere very special today, a place where we can have a nice, long chat about your future here at." The prince felt his feet grow heavy, as if the ancient stones beneath them had suddenly become quicksand. Something about the way she emphasized the word long made his heart begin to race, though he could not understand why. His mother had always taught him to be respectful to adults, especially those his father trusted, but every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to run. "Where would you like to take me, lady?" he asked, proud that his voice remained steady despite the fear growing in his chest like a cold, dark flower. Her smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth that reminded him uncomfortably of a wolf's fangs. "To the old chapel, dear one. It's such a peaceful place, perfect for the kind of conversation we need to have. Your father is so busy with affairs of state, and I thought it would be wonderful if you and I could spend some quality time together, just the two of us." The old chapel had been abandoned for nearly a century, ever since lightning had struck its bell tower during a terrible storm, and the subsequent fire had damaged much of its interior. Prince Alexander had only seen it from a distance, a crumbling stone structure covered in ivy and surrounded by overgrown gardens where wildflowers bloomed between broken statuary. "Is father really expecting us there?" the prince asked, though something deep in his mind already knew the answer. Lady's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful but somehow wrong in the dusty silence of the corridor. "Of course, darling, he's very eager for us to become a real family, and sometimes that requires certain adjustments to be made." The way she said the word adjustments made Prince Alexander's blood run cold, but before he could protest or ask what she meant, Lady had taken his arm in a grip that felt far stronger than her delicate appearance would suggest. Her fingers were like iron bands wrapped in silk, and though she continued to smile, her eyes had taken on a hardness that made them look like polished stones. "Come along now," she said, her voice losing some of its artificial sweetness. "We mustn't keep your father waiting." As they walked through the castle's corridors toward the eastern exit that led to the chapel grounds, Prince Alexander noticed how the few servants they encountered quickly averted their eyes and hurried away. None of them met his gaze, and he realized with growing horror that whatever was happening had been planned in advance. The autumn air hit his face like a slap as they stepped outside, but Lady's grip on his arm never loosened. If anything, it seemed to tighten as they walked across the cobblestone courtyard toward the overgrown path that led to the abandoned chapel. The old structure loomed before them like a monument to forgotten prayers, its broken spires reaching toward gray clouds that seemed to be gathering with unnatural speed. Ivy covered most of its walls, and several of the stained glass windows had been shattered by storms or time, leaving jagged holes that looked like dead eyes staring out at the world. As they approached the heavy wooden door, Prince Alexander made one last attempt to understand what was happening. "Lady, I really think I should return to the castle. My tutor will be looking for me soon, and I have lessons to attend." She turned to look at him then, and all pretense of kindness had vanished from her face. Her beauty remained, but it was now cold and terrible, like a statue carved from ice. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "Your lessons can wait, Prince Alexander. Today, you're going to learn something far more important than anything your dusty old tutor could teach you. You're going to learn exactly what your place will be in the new order that's coming too." The chapel door creaked open on rusty hinges, revealing an interior shrouded in shadows and filled with the musty smell of decay and abandonment. Broken pews lay scattered across a floor covered in fallen leaves and debris. The altar, once magnificent, was now cracked and stained, and the few remaining windows cast eerie patterns of colored light across the desolation. Prince Alexander tried to pull away, but Lady's grip was relentless. She guided him inside with the inexorable force of fate itself, and as the door swung shut behind them with a sound like a coffin lid closing, the prince realized that whatever was about to happen in this forgotten place of worship would change his life forever. The last thing he saw before Lady pushed him deeper into the chapel's gloom was her smile returning, more terrible than ever, as she whispered words that would haunt his dreams for years to come. "Welcome to your new home, little prince. I do hope you'll find it educational." The chapel's interior felt colder than the autumn air outside, as if the very stones held memories of winter that never ended. Prince Alexander's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering through the broken, stained glass windows, revealing the full extent of the destruction that time and neglect had wrought upon this once sacred space. Lady released his arm but positioned herself between him and the door, her emerald dress a splash of vibrant color against the gray desolation surrounding them. Her beauty had taken on an otherworldly quality in the filtered light, like a portrait painted by an artist who understood darkness better than joy. "Now then," she said, her voice echoing in the hollow space, "we can finally have that conversation I mentioned. You see, Alexander, your father and I have been discussing your future, and we've come to some important conclusions about the direction this kingdom needs to take." Prince Alexander backed away slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Behind him, the ruined altar loomed, its carved angels now faceless and worn, their wings broken and scattered across the floor like abandoned prayers. "What kind of conclusions?" he asked, surprised by how small his voice sounded in the vast emptiness of the chapel. Lady began to walk slowly around the perimeter of the space, her footsteps creating a rhythm that reminded the prince uncomfortably of a predator circling its prey. As she moved, she trailed one elegant finger along the broken pews and crumbling walls, as if she were claiming ownership of everything she touched. "Your father is not a young man anymore, Alexander. The responsibilities of ruling have worn heavily upon him, especially since your dear mother's passing. He needs support, guidance, someone who can help him make the difficult decisions that leadership requires. Someone who understands that sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good." The prince pressed himself against the cold stone of the altar, feeling the rough edges of broken carvings dig into his back through his jacket. "What does that have to do with me? I'm still just a child. I won't be ready to rule for many years." Lady's laugh was like glass breaking in the distance. "Oh, my sweet boy, but that's exactly the problem, isn't it? Many years. Your father doesn't have many years left to give to this kingdom, and when he's gone, what then? A child king, easily manipulated by ambitious nobles who care more about their own power than the welfare of the realm." She stopped directly in front of him then, close enough that he could see his own reflection in her dark eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried perfectly in the acoustics of the ruined chapel. "No, Alexander, that simply won't do. This kingdom needs strong leadership, decisive action, and most importantly, it needs someone who isn't bound by the sentimental attachments that have made your father weak. Someone who can make the hard choices that true power requires. The full meaning of her words hit Prince Alexander like a physical blow. His legs suddenly felt too weak to support him, and he slid down the front of the altar until he was sitting on the cold stone floor, staring up at the woman who had just revealed herself to be something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. "You want to take my father's throne," he whispered, the words barely audible even in the chapel's perfect silence. Her smile was radiant and terrible. "I want to save this kingdom from the weakness that has infected it like a plague. Your father's grief has made him vulnerable, compassionate to a fault, unwilling to take the actions necessary to secure our borders and strengthen our armies. Under his rule has become a target for our enemies, a kingdom ripe for conquest." She knelt down in front of him, her face now level with his, and when she continued speaking, her voice carried a hypnotic quality that made it difficult for the prince to think clearly. "But you, dear Alexander, you represent the old ways, the sentimental traditions that have weakened this realm. As long as you exist, there will always be those who believe that kindness and mercy are more important than strength and decisive action." The prince tried to stand, to run, to do anything that might get him away from this woman and her terrible words, but his body seemed frozen in place. It was as if her voice had cast a spell over him, binding him to the cold stone floor as surely as iron chains. "What are you going to do to me?" he managed to ask, though part of him already knew the answer. Lady reached out and touched his cheek with fingers that felt like ice wrapped in silk. "I'm going to ensure that you understand your place in the new order that's coming too. Your father believes you're spending the day with your tutor, working on your studies in the library. No one will think to look for you here until it's far too late." She stood then and walked to a section of the chapel where several large stones had fallen from the walls over the years, creating a natural alcove hidden in shadow. With strength that seemed impossible for someone of her slight build, she began to move the stones, revealing a narrow space behind them that looked like it might once have been used to store religious artifacts. "You see, Alexander, sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is to help them disappear before they can cause more harm to themselves or others. Your father's attachment to you has become a weakness that our enemies could exploit. By removing that weakness, I'm actually protecting both you and the kingdom." Terror flooded through Prince Alexander's veins like liquid fire, finally breaking whatever spell had held him motionless. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the chapel door, his footsteps echoing like thunder in the hollow space. But Lady moved with inhuman speed, intercepting him before he could reach the exit. Her hands closed on his shoulders with a grip that felt strong enough to crush stone, and she lifted him off his feet as easily as if he weighed no more than a feather. Now," she said, her voice mockingly gentle as she carried him back toward the alcove she had prepared. "There's no need to make this more difficult than it has to be. Think of this as an extended period of reflection, a time for you to consider what kind of person you want to be when you grow up." The prince struggled with all his strength, kicking and twisting in her grasp, but it was like fighting against iron bands wrapped in velvet. Lady's beauty never wavered, even as she forced him into the narrow space behind the fallen stones, and her voice remained calm and reasonable even as she began to seal him inside. "The groundskeeper makes his rounds of this area once a week," she said conversationally as she moved the heavy stones back into place. "Sometimes twice if the weather has been particularly harsh. You'll have plenty of time to think about our conversation and what it means for your future." The last sliver of light disappeared as the final stone slid into place, leaving Prince Alexander in a darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. He could hear Lady's footsteps moving away from the alcove, growing fainter as she crossed the chapel toward the door. Just before she left, her voice drifted back to him one final time, carrying clearly despite the stone barrier between them. "I do hope you'll use this time wisely, dear boy. When you emerge from this experience, I expect you to have gained a much better understanding of how the world really works." The chapel door creaked open, and then closed with a sound like destiny sealing itself shut. Prince Alexander was alone in the darkness, trapped in a space barely large enough for his small body, with only his fear and the cold stone walls for company. Hours passed like centuries. The prince shouted until his voice became hoarse and then faded to a whisper. He pushed against the stones until his hands were scraped and bleeding, but Lady had chosen her prison well. The rocks were too heavy for a child to move, and the alcove was positioned in such a way that his voice could barely carry beyond the chapel's walls. As the darkness deepened and the temperature began to drop with the approaching night, Prince Alexander finally understood the true extent of Lady's plan. She hadn't just trapped him physically. She had trapped him in a nightmare from which there might be no awakening. Outside the chapel, the wind began to howl through the broken windows like the voices of all the prayers that would never again be answered in this forgotten place of worship. The night seemed to last forever in the stone prison, where Prince Alexander found himself trapped. Hours crawled by like wounded animals, each minute stretching into an eternity of cold darkness and growing despair. The prince had long since stopped shouting for help, his voice reduced to a painful whisper that barely carried beyond the confines of his makeshift tomb. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the broken chapel windows, casting eerie patterns across the debris-strewn floor, Alexander had almost given up hope entirely. His body ached from being cramped in the narrow space, his hands were raw from clawing at the stones, and hunger gnawed at his stomach like a living thing. It was then that he heard something that made his heart leap with desperate hope, footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves outside the chapel. The sounds were different from Lady's measured, predatory pace. These footsteps were heavier, more practical, accompanied by the soft whistle of someone who worked with their hands and found joy in simple melodies. The prince recognized the tune immediately. It was an old folk song that his mother used to hum while tending to her garden. Old Thomas had been the castle's groundskeeper for more than 30 years, arriving as a young man shortly after the current king's coronation. His weathered face had smiled down at Prince Alexander countless times during the boy's childhood adventures in the castle gardens, and his gentle hands had taught the prince how to coax flowers from unwilling soil and how to read the secret language that trees spoke through their changing leaves. The footsteps paused outside the chapel door, and Thomas's voice drifted through the morning air as he spoke to someone, probably his old dog, Copper, who followed him everywhere on his daily rounds. "Well now, old boy," Thomas said, his voice carrying the warm accent of the mountain villages where he had been born. "Looks like someone's been visiting our forgotten chapel. See these footprints in the mud, fresh as yesterday's bread they are." Prince Alexander summoned every ounce of strength remaining in his small body and began to pound against the stones with his fists, each impact sending waves of pain up his arms, but also creating sounds that just might, be heard by the man outside. "Help," he called, his voice cracked and barely audible even to his own ears. "Thomas, please, I'm trapped inside." The footsteps stopped completely, and for a terrifying moment, Alexander thought his cries had been too weak to penetrate the stone walls. Then he heard Thomas's voice again, closer now, filled with concern and confusion. "Copper, did you hear that?" Sounded almost like. The groundskeeper's voice trailed off, and then his footsteps were moving quickly toward the chapel door. The ancient hinges protested with rusty screams as Thomas pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. His weathered boots crunched across broken glass and fallen debris as he moved deeper into the ruined space, calling out as he searched. "Hello, is someone in here? If this is some kind of game, young master, it's not a very funny one." "Thomas," Alexander called again, putting every remaining bit of energy into his voice. "I'm behind the stones, near the back wall. Lady trapped me here." The footsteps moved swiftly across the chapel floor, accompanied by the clicking of Copper's claws on stone. Within moments, Thomas's voice was much closer, filled with alarm and determination. "Prince Alexander, my God, boy, what's happened to you? Hold tight now, I'll have you out of there faster than lightning." The sound of stones being moved was like music to the prince's ears. Thomas worked with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades handling heavy materials, and within minutes, enough rocks had been cleared away to create an opening large enough for Alexander to squeeze through. Light flooded into the alcove like a blessing from heaven, and Thomas's concerned face appeared in the gap, his eyes wide with shock and anger as he took in the prince's condition. "Come on then, lad," he said gently, extending his strong, calloused hands. "Let's get you out of this cursed place and back where you belong." Prince Alexander grabbed Thomas's hands with desperate gratitude, feeling strength flow back into his limbs as the groundskeeper carefully pulled him from his stone prison. The sensation of being able to move freely again was so overwhelming that the prince nearly collapsed. But Thomas caught him and held him steady with the gentle firmness of someone who understood both plants and people. "There now," Thomas murmured, his voice filled with the same warmth he used when coaxing frightened animals to trust him. "You're safe now, Prince Alexander. Old Thomas has got you, and nothing's going to harm you while I'm here." As feeling returned to his cramped limbs, Alexander found himself shaking not just from cold and exhaustion, but from the memory of Lady, terrible words, and the certainty in her voice when she had spoken of her plans for the kingdom. "Thomas," he said urgently, gripping the groundskeeper's jacket with hands that still trembled. "We have to warn my father. Lady isn't who she pretends to be. She wants to take the throne, and she said terrible things about making sacrifices for the greater good." The groundskeeper's weathered face grew grim as he listened to the prince's hurried explanation. Thomas had lived it long enough to recognize the signs of palace intrigue, and his sharp eyes had noticed changes in the castle's atmosphere since Lady's arrival. "Aye, lad," he said quietly, helping Alexander to his feet and wrapping his own thick cloak around the boy's shivering shoulders. "I've seen the way the horses shy away from her, and how the kitchen cats hide when she passes by. Animals know things about people that we sometimes miss." Together, they made their way out of the ruined chapel and into the morning sunlight that felt like redemption itself. Copper, Thomas's faithful companion, wagged his tail enthusiastically at seeing the prince safe, as if he too understood the importance of this rescue. As they walked back toward the castle, Thomas listened carefully to every detail of Alexander's ordeal, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. The groundskeeper had served the royal family with unwavering loyalty for 3 decades, and the thought that someone could threaten the prince under his watch filled him with a cold fury that few had ever seen. "We'll go straight to your father," Thomas said as they approached the castle's main entrance. "But we'll need to be careful about how we handle this, Prince Alexander. Lady has had months to weave whatever web she's spinning, and powerful people often have powerful friends." The castle guards who saw them approach showed immediate concern at the prince's disheveled appearance, but Thomas's presence and his reputation as the most trustworthy man on the grounds assured them that everything was under control. Within minutes, word had been sent to King Edmund that his son needed to speak with him urgently about a matter of great importance. The reunion between father and son was filled with relief, anger, and a growing understanding of just how close they had come to losing everything they held dear. As Prince Alexander told his story, King Edmund's face transformed from confusion to horror, to a cold determination that reminded everyone present why he had earned his crown through both wisdom and strength. Lady was quietly arrested that afternoon while taking tea in the castle's rose garden, her beautiful face showing no surprise when the guards approached. She submitted to their custody with the same elegant grace she had shown throughout her months as if she had always known this moment would come. During her questioning, she revealed the full extent of her plans with the same calm precision she had used when explaining them to Prince Alexander in the ruined chapel. Her network of supporters was vast and well-funded. Her timeline for taking control of the kingdom had been measured in weeks rather than months, and her methods would have made even the most hardened political strategists shudder with their cold efficiency. But she had made one crucial mistake in her calculations. She had underestimated the power of simple human decency and the bonds that connected all the people who truly cared about. From the groundskeeper who noticed when something was wrong, to the prince who had the courage to speak truth to power, to the king who valued loyalty and love over political convenience. As autumn faded into winter and the castle returned to something resembling normalcy, Prince Alexander often found himself walking through the gardens with Thomas, learning not just about plants and seasons, but about the importance of paying attention to the world around him and trusting the people who had proven their worth through years of faithful service. The ruined chapel was eventually restored, not as a monument to what had been lost, but as a reminder that even in the darkest places, hope could survive if people were willing to listen for voices calling out for help. And on quiet mornings when the mist clung to the castle grounds, those who knew the story could sometimes hear the echo of old Thomas's whistle, carrying the tune of an ancient song about the triumph of light over darkness. Years later, when Prince Alexander had grown into a wise and just ruler, he would often tell the story of his ordeal to young knights and nobles, not as a tale of his own suffering, but as a lesson about the importance of surrounding oneself with people who valued truth over flattery, loyalty over ambition, and the simple courage to do what was right even when no one was watching. For in the end, it was not royal blood or political power that had saved the kingdom, but the steady footsteps of an old groundskeeper who cared enough to listen for cries in the darkness and brave enough to answer them when they came.